and welcome to Macro Bites, the economics and politics podcast from Aberdeen. I'm your host, Steph. I'm the Deputy Head of the Aberdeen Research Institute. And on a previous episode of this podcast, we talked about our gender equality research, A Woman's Place. And the idea behind this research is really making it clear the case for governments and for companies to take action to boost female participation in order to boost long-term outcomes. Now, we talked before about the absolutely crucial role that parental leave, particularly for fathers, has to play in terms of boosting female participation in the workforce. But policymakers and companies can do more to create opportunities to reduce the barriers to women in the workforce, both in terms of the decision to participate at all and also in how many hours they choose to work. So joining me today to talk through our latest research findings is Abigail Watt, a research economist here at Aberdeen. Thanks very much for joining again, Abby.
Thank you for having me back.
So we have been working on this for a year and a half now, but I think it's worth going back right to the start, because naturally, sometimes the conversations about gender equality can verge into the sort of ethical side of things, which of course there are very strong ethical arguments, but there are also really strong economic arguments. And I think one assumption that's sometimes made is that everyone has equal opportunities and women just choose and there aren't these barriers. So is it worth maybe just starting out by talking about how different we see the figures for women depending on their personal circumstances in terms of determining how likely they are to work?
Yeah, it's really interesting if we look at the data. I mean, you can see in every OECD economy that female participation rates are lower than male participation rates when you look at the aggregate. But what's really interesting is if you dig into the detail of participation rates by kind of household situation of women, you can see some really stark differences, even, I guess, across the households types within women. So if you look at that, you can see that 82% of single women living alone participate in the labour market. But then if you look at women who are living with a partner, this drops down to 64%. And then if you look at women who are living with a partner and have children, that drops even lower to around 50%. And then It's even kind of more stark if we compare that to men, Steph.
Right, yeah, because we're not talking about the same kind of numbers at all. As far as I remember, no matter what a man's household situation is, his percentage begins with a 90, right?
Yeah, so the kind of overall participation rate of men is around 90% if they're living alone. And then interestingly, it actually rises when they live with a partner. So that goes up to 94%. And then again, it increases even further if they are living with a partner and have children, and that goes up to 96%. So there seems to be really different implications for men and women depending on their household situation.
And that's super interesting to me, because I think it tells you something about the responsiveness of men and women to incentives, but also maybe the incentives that exist that we can't see or that we're not that aware of, sort of invisible barriers to entry and invisible barriers to being involved in the workforce. I was interested as well, and a big part of the research this time around was not just around gender on its own, but actually the impact that it can have on women from different ethnic backgrounds. And in particular, we know that particularly Black and Hispanic women are much more likely to leave the workforce or reduce their hours than women without children, and indeed men, as you said, with or without children, because of issues like childcare. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But first off, sometimes tax can feel like a really dull topic, and maybe that's why it flies so low, kind of below the radar when it comes to conversations about gender equality. You know, it's not the sexiest thing to talk about, but Abby, obviously our work has shown that tax is an important component to consider. And what kinds of tax barriers are there? What ways should we be thinking about this in terms of, I suppose, hours worked versus kind of being in the workforce at all?
That's exactly right. When we did our original research, we looked at the decision to participate at all and the influence that some average tax burdens can have on kind of female and male choice to participate in the labour force. So we originally looked at average tax burdens, and we focused in on two household types in particular. what we looked at was the tax burdens for households in which there's two earners and households have children. So the kind of relative burden where you have a second earner in a household. And we found that that was kind of negatively related to participation rates for women. So this basically suggests that the kind of higher the relative tax burden is for households where there's two earners, the lower female participation would be on average. And then the other area that we looked at in the original work was we considered the average tax burdens for single parents. And with women much more likely to be the single parents, around 80% of single parent households are led by women in the OECD. We found that that also was negatively related to female participation. And interestingly, there has been a lot of progress made in the OECD over the past 20 years in terms of the relative burden faced by single parents, but that's not necessarily the case in terms of the relative burdens that's faced by second earners and those people who are the second earners in households where you have two earners. And then, I mean, you mentioned the difference in the implications for kind of hours worked as well. If we look at hours worked, there's other measures of the tax system that kind of are more appropriate to look at. So, for example, looking at marginal effective tax rates is likely a better measure.
So, Abby, I mean, I think what really strikes me about that is obviously the evidence is that women facing average tax rates is a disincentive to work, to be in the workforce. But in terms of the actual numbers that we put into the report, what was really striking is that there is a higher tax burden faced by two earner married couples with two kids versus a single earner married couple with two kids. So it's genuinely visible across basically nearly all OECD countries. You see this kind of gap coming through, and that was, in a way, like quite surprising that there is a genuine tax barrier to work, which says if you have a second earner, the average taxes your household faces will be higher.
Yeah, and it's worth knowing that it doesn't just come through the kind of increased actual tax bill. It also comes through a loss in qualification for benefits as you increase the amount of hours you work and you increase participation in the labour force.
Right, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And then obviously, as you kind of mentioned, single parents do actually face kind of lower average taxes than single people without children. So there does seem to be, it seems like policymakers have gotten that bit sort of right. Is that fair? They're more aware of the single parent challenge, maybe?
Yeah, it's definitely the case that across I think every OECD economy, the barrier for participation is kind of lower for single parents when we're looking at that specific metric.
Okay, cool. So I guess that's the incentive to be in the workforce, or indeed not be in the workforce. So then in terms of the hours you want to work, obviously we've done a little bit more work into the effect of marginal effective tax rates. And so for the non-economist listeners to this podcast, can you just briefly explain what marginal effective tax rates are?
Yeah, so if we're looking at the marginal effective tax rate, what we're thinking about is the additional tax that's going to be paid as you earn an extra dollar. And what we're looking at with this metric is if I increase my hours from 50% of full-time to 100% of full-time, how does that change my overall tax bill? And as I mentioned just a second ago, it also considers the kind of qualification for benefits as you increase those hours worked as well.
Right. So that's, again, an important component is there are incentives, there can be incentives in certain systems to basically not increase yours. Is that essentially what you found? I mean, we're looking at marginal effective tax rates. How significant is it if you go from 50 to 100%? How significant is the challenge that creates in terms of hours worked?
If we look at the marginal effective tax rates for single parents in particular, they can be very prohibitive. And in a number of OECD economies, these are over 50% if we look at the marginal effective tax rate. And the key component of that is that qualification for benefits. A lot of OECD economies have quite generous policies around the provision of childcare benefits and benefits for children within households. And so that kind of loss of those benefits as single parents increase their hours worked plays a larger role in increasing that marginal effective tax rate.
And so then if we go into the last kind of tax element of our research, it was around the effect of joint tax filing, which, again, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on where you live, maybe something, that you've never even considered. But it's interesting that our research did find that there is a sort of an impact on participation from how jointly taxes are filed together.
Yeah. So when we consider the jointness of the tax system, this is basically whether households file their taxes jointly or whether you file as an individual. And one of the interesting things is that this means that the second earner's income and tax bill becomes a function of the first earner's income. Which means that, if you file jointly, you can face a much higher tax rate than you would if you filed individually. And it's not necessarily just taxes as well. It's also the case that, like, in certain household situations, your qualification for benefits might be different. So, for example, marriage allowances and things like that will also impact, I guess, your desire to work as well. If we're thinking about incentives. And it's really interesting because there is some kind of cross-country evidence looking specifically at the impact of this kind of jointness of tax systems and the implications of that for the number of hours that men and women choose to work. And what that research actually found was that on average, women's hours, married women's hours would increase by 10.5% if those systems were to shift from a joint taxation to an individual taxation. It does differ obviously across countries, but that was the kind of average effect that was found. And in a number of OECD economies, these are still the policies that are in place.
Wow, gosh, that's really quite significant. And I think, just in terms of summarizing then, so on the tax side, we know average tax rates matter, and we know that as it stands, many systems disadvantage dual earner kind of two children households versus a single earner two children household. We know that marginal effective tax rates, it sounds like, are important for hours worked, but that policymakers have more of an eye on that. And then around the jointness, clearly joint taxation can have an impact on the likelihood that women work as well. So it's really quite striking stuff. And what's related to the question, I think, of whether women work or not and why women are self-selecting out, and crucially the impact of having children that we talked about right at the beginning, is that impact of who minds the child. And I was really struck when we started doing this research that, there tends to be, from kind of the age of 4 upwards, depending on the country you live in, there's pretty much kind of full-time education from the age of 4 upwards is standard kind of provided by the state. And again, depending on the country you live in, mothers tend to be given somewhere between, a couple of months, maybe up to even a couple of years, depending on the system that they're in and the employer they work for maternity leave. But it does create this gap in this period of time where you've got kind of kids aged kind of 2 through potentially 5 without kind of free state kind of care for the most part. You don't have across the board, across countries, a globally acknowledged kind of state pre-education system. Just doesn't tend to be the case. Obviously, we know there are exceptions, but we also as a society really believe that children of that age should be taken care of, right? They're toddlers. They're generally not supposed to be left alone. So it's also a natural question to ask is, if not a parent and, the gender biases and the policy barriers that exist mean it tends to be women, then who? And we know in some countries there's more informal childcare that takes place. But the second part of this research was very much around kind of women with children, and particularly how you address that childcare gap. So in terms of the two big gaps, Abby, it's maybe worth us highlighting the challenge when it comes to cost, and then the challenge when it comes to supply, right?
Yeah, exactly. Clearly, there's going to be an implication for women's ability to participate in the labour force with that big chasm of time where the child has to be looked after and taken care of. And there was some really interesting research out of the US that we'd highlighted in the report, where we were considering the implications of not just childcare costs, but also the kind of quality of childcare.
Right.
And then the final element as well, which maybe you didn't touch on there as well, is the supply of that childcare
Yeah.
in terms of access.
Yeah. Yeah, spot on. And in particular, so this was a piece of research done by the Center of American Progress, and it was really super useful research. And again, it broke down not just in terms of gender, but also in terms of background, in terms of kind of ethnic background, but also economic status, a couple of different ways. And I thought what was really interesting was the idea that kind of across the board, particularly in the United States, and unfortunately, that's where the best data is on this, ironically, because it has such substantial issues when it comes to childcare access. So it's difficult to compare across, but to start with the US anyway, cost was cited as kind of a major concern and problem for households pretty much across the board. I mean, naturally, the higher the household income, the less of an issue it was, which makes sense. Those kind of high income households were more concerned about access to access to open slots and high quality when it comes to childcare, which again just reflects, I think, the realities of that. But what we also saw was that in a 2018 survey, 51% of African American mothers and 48% of Hispanic mothers said that they would look for a higher paying job if they could get affordable, reliable healthcare. And 20% of mothers who were surveyed who weren't currently working would look for a job if that safe, affordable childcare was available, which I think is just really quite astounding and tells you something about the potential benefits that the female labor force participation could provide. If more women were in the workforce, if you had 20% of mothers who aren't currently working saying that they would go back, that's really quite striking. And we also know that, as we talked about earlier, it's not just about being in the workforce, it's also about taking on, as I mentioned, higher paying job, taking on more hours, that kind of thing. It's all very much related. So Abby, maybe obviously we talk a lot about the US. I think the data in the US is really useful and interesting because you get that nuance. And in particular, that there are real challenges that African American and Hispanic households face, and in particular mothers. But in terms of childcare costs writ large, let's talk a little bit about the challenges across OECD economies, because the US is not in a great position, but it's not the only country that is.
That's exactly right, Steph. There is quite a lot of divergence across economies in terms of childcare costs. The UK stands out in particular as somewhere where childcare costs can be quite prohibitive. In particular, for two-earner married couples, we can see that it's kind of over 50% of women's median full-time earnings would go to childcare costs,
which is incredible, right? Like, imagine 50% of your pay is, like, what is your incentive to work if over half of it is going to be spent on childcare, which you're having to pay for because you are working? It's such a kind of doom loop that you get into, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And then you link that in with some of the other elements of the tax and benefit system that we've found have also kind of negatively impacted that kind of incentive to re-enter the labour market, or even to increase hours worked. And it kind of just kind of builds up a story as to why we can see such low participation rates of women across these different household situations.
Yeah, totally. And it's worth, I mean, a bit of a warning is we did look across OECD countries, but so many of the data points were like specific cities, which makes it harder to give really kind of broader views on the kind of, a number of European countries and major markets. But the point, I think, very much still stands. And where we saw kind of contentiousness around, is this the right number or the wrong number on childcare? Usually there was upward pressure on the number. We didn't find a case where there was a country that was showing numbers that were much higher than was the reality in the country, which I think is super important. So maybe just to finish up, obviously we've talked a lot about cost. Obviously supply is a huge problem as well. Either way, in terms of solutions, which is what this research is all about, is trying to find solutions to boost female participation, not just kind of complain about all the problems, although we've spent plenty of time doing that. I think there are a couple of really good options. So one is just around childcare provision. So governments have an important role to play. We know from the evidence, the empirical evidence that exists, that it is better to have kind of direct provision rather than things like kind of cash benefits, just in terms of they help with like poverty alleviation, but not directly childcare access. So direct provision by governments tends to be the most kind of effective way of ensuring that childcare takes place. But at the same time, it's worth mentioning that is extremely costly, and requires quite a wholesale change in provision across a number of countries, which is really tough. We also talk a little bit in the research about the importance of kind of companies having to fill that gap because governments are so far behind, Abby.
Yeah, exactly. We've suggested in the report that companies could go some way to kind of try and provide childcare options for their employees. I mean, we haven't been able to kind of do any empirical work on this because, again, we don't have a view of kind of what those policies look like where companies are providing childcare for employees. So it's hard to kind of tangibly say what the positive impact is, but you would expect that there should be kind of some positive externality for the company in terms of employee retention and, I guess, employee satisfaction as well from providing that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think not just in terms of gender equality, but also in terms of ethnic diversity and inclusion, which is increasingly important to companies, right? Given that we know the realities around the challenges that people from those backgrounds face. I think we talk a little bit about the options companies have. So we see quite a spectrum between kind of paid caregivers leave, which is just kind of creating the space for when something goes wrong. So this isn't really kind of ongoing childcare. It's just if there's an emergency. The word of warning we kind of apply to this, though, is it might provide temporary relief, but it can also reinforce gendered care work trade-offs because on average, women have greater caring burdens. And so it's more likely that it's the woman who takes the caregiver's leave on an emergency, and that might reinforce some of those gendered kind of assumptions about who takes care of the children and elderly parents and things like that. Otherwise, we looked at things like subsidies for childcare. So some companies provide subsidies to help to foot the bill, which can be helpful. That we also find backup childcare is a pretty popular option for some of the large tech companies, which basically means working with a large childcare provider network to give staff kind of several hours or days of backup childcare when they need, which can be in home or in centre, depending on the program. And then obviously the sort of the theoretical gold standard, which speaks to some of the government implications as well, is on-site childcare. So that idea of there are a small proportion of companies who provide childcare on site. Obviously, this is very logistically challenging and costly to run, but for companies that can action it, the solution is particularly helpful to smooth the transition from maternity leave back into the office, and are particularly relevant in particular where these kind of childcare deserts where there just aren't good alternatives. Now, we don't make, as Abby said, we can't do any research as to which works best. We can just make kind of educated assessments of what the potential benefits are. But overall, I think our research continues to point to the need for greater understanding, both by companies and by policymakers, around the invisible barriers to women, both working and returning to work, particularly after having children. And we'll continue this work throughout 2022. We're at the moment finishing up a piece of work looking at parental leave policies at the FTSE level. Actually, we went to companies and surveyed them. So we'll come back on this podcast and talk about it again soon. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Abby, for joining.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have left for this week. But if you'd like to find out any more about our research into gender equality, you can check out the A Woman's Place landing site on the Aberdeen website. And please do join us again in a couple of weeks when we'll be switching gears to explore the impact of the Omicron variant on the economic outlook. So please do join us then.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication, and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen. The companies discussed in this podcast have been selected for illustrative purposes only, or to demonstrate our investment management style and not as an investment recommendation or indication of their future performance. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns, return projections, or estimates, and provide no guarantee of future results.